Christ in your heart, certainly that's a very simple subject, and it expresses, I think, a very simple idea. And yet I wonder if it isn't the very essence of Christianity to feel Christ in your heart. Christianity, as I know and as you know, is a system of great ideas. It is a social philosophy, it is a system of theology, but reduced to its lowest terms, its most fundamental meaning is a personal relationship with Jesus in your soul, in my soul. I have known some very great Christians in my time, and I know you have also. And the greater Christians they are, inevitably the more simple and humble they are. The greater they are, the more profoundly do they have this feeling of Christ in their own heart and soul. I remember so well when I was young and just starting out to preach the gospel. I was a pastoral intern at a summer resort area. This was part of our seminary training, which we had to do either an associateship or to take some church, smaller church to be sure, but to take some church by ourselves. And I chose to take this church in this resort area, an area which teemed with life during the summer. In fact, about half of my congregation were weekend visitors or those who stayed longer, even for 3 months. And some of these were university professors and were men of considerable reputation. And I was young, very immature, and they awed me. I thought that I had to preach erudite or learned intellectual sermons in order to prove to them that I too was attempting to be a scholar. It was one of these men, a dean in the University of Indiana, who came to me one day and said, "Myron, I'm much older than you, and I would like to give you just a little bit of advice. Don't ever be awed by these college professors attending your church during these summer months particularly. They may be great men in their own particular departments, but never forget that they are first of all human beings. When I come to church on Sunday, I want you to forget that I am a so-called scholar and just preach to me as yet another person who is in need of the worship experience. Tell me, and I shall never forget how he said it or how he expressed it. Tell me how to have the feeling of Jesus Christ in my own heart and in my own soul." That man, and I can see him now, was as simple and loving and tender a Christian, I believe, as I have ever known. The thought of him brings back to me another memory. Though the two are not at all connected, there's no connection between them except that they both concern people who wanted to have Jesus Christ in their hearts. This memory is of an old woman whom I met for the first time near Wabash, Indiana. I was once asked by her grandson, a physician in Indianapolis, to go and see her. He had written to me about her. "She has hardly a cent to her name," he wrote, "but her laugh is like music." He had told me how many children and grandchildren she had helped to put through school, including himself. Well, I went out to her place, a humble little house at the end of a long dirt road, but I found nobody at home. And just as I was leaving, I noticed an old woman coming down that road with a bundle on her back. And she had sort of a rolling gait, somewhat like a sailor's, I would expect. And she was singing softly. As she came nearer, I could tell by the sound of the music that the words may well have been, "Rescue the perishing. Duty demands its strength for thy labor, the Lord will provide. Back to the narrow way, patiently win them. Tell the poor wanderer, a Savior has died." Down in the human heart, crushed by the tempter, feelings lie buried that grace can restore. touched by a loving heart, ushered and wakened by kindness, chords that were broken will vibrate once more. I waited until she got up to the house. "Are you Mrs. Brain?" I asked. "Land's sake, yes, young man." She said, "What do you want?" "I just came over to see you." "Now, isn't that nice of you? But what did you come to see me for?" she persisted. "Well, your grandson, Dr. Brain, wrote to me about you," I said. "He told me that you were an angel on 2 feet, and I just wanted to see an angel on 2 feet." "Land's sakes, young Revner, I ain't no angel," she said. "And he told me that your laugh was like music," I continued. And at that she did laugh, and he was right, I continued. That boy, he shouldn't be saying things like that, but she was obviously very pleased. I went into the house with her, and she showed me pictures of all of those children I had been told that she helped to educate. And while I was looking at them, her telephone rang. "Now, honey, don't worry. I'll be over there this afternoon and I'll prop you up," she said to someone at the other end of the line. "That poor rich woman," she explained to me when she hung up, "she's having a horrible time. I've got to go over there this afternoon. She does take an awful lot of propping." I had wondered about her having a telephone, but obviously it was so that those in need of propping could reach her promptly. This old woman was an absolute radiant individual. "How did you get this way?" I finally asked her. "How do you find this peace and this happiness?" "Land's sakes, Revner," she said, as though she were talking to just a child, "I just have Jesus in my heart." Well, that's a very simple story, is it not? But you know and I know that the essence of art is simplicity. That old woman, like the university dean, was just radiantly good. She had received little enough education for herself, though she had labored hard and long in order to provide education for the children. But believe me, she could have gained honors and degrees in the art of spirituality. I looked back as I saw her standing there on her sagging, unpainted porch, and I caught my breath at the radiance that shone from her face. And I went home and I wrote down this story in order that I would tell it again and again throughout the years of my ministry. That radiance, that heartfelt love is what we all want to find beyond the ideas and the ideals of theology and philosophy. When we have that feeling of Jesus Christ in our hearts, then we can say, like the disciples of long ago, "Did not our hearts burn within us while we walked and talked with him by the way?" Now the question is, how do you feel Christ in your heart? Well, again, I think it is very simple. Just have love in your hearts, and then you will have Christ there. I believe that I should say, because I am sure it is true, that nobody ever entered into the meaning of fellowship with Jesus Christ who had hate in his or her heart. From the Bible, we can read that from the beginning to the end, it says, "Love one another." Love one another. There's a story about the Apostle John who, when he was a very old man and blind, and he was brought into the company of a great many Christians, and they asked him if he had a message for them because they realized that his time, the end of his time, was coming very near. And you must remember that he was one of those whose eyes had actually looked upon the Master. He was that one whose ears had heard the voice of the Master, who had walked with him and who had talked with him. And what do you think that John told him? Stretching out his hands as if to bless them, he said, "Little children, love one another." That is the way to have the Spirit of Christ in your heart. The longer I live, the more I wonder at the way people rationalize about their religion. If a man doesn't run off with another man's wife, if he doesn't steal, if he doesn't get drunk, if he goes to church regularly and can be heard to mumble the creed, or if he decides against the historic tradition of the church, the rich heritage with which we were nurtured in the faith, and decides to go after the more easy way that we see following all around us, the more spontaneous kind of worship that people say is more real, then people say, well, they're Christian. He or she is a Christian. Well, maybe, maybe not. All of that may be important, but I have known pious people who are as mean as the devil. And you cannot have Jesus Christ in your heart if you are mean. I will never forget a letter that I received in the earlier days of my ministry from a man who was asking me what he could do with his wife. He stated, there isn't a thing in the world wrong with her. She never got drunk in her life. She never swore. She never wronged anybody, but she's as mean as the devil. And he went on to list the ways that she was mean by his own selfish judgment. But do you know what effect that letter had upon me? I wasn't at all impressed with the meanness of his wife. But you know, I really did realize how mean he was as I read his letter. You can't talk about anybody that way and not be mean. I have lived with my wife for 30 years, his letter ended. All of our children are gone. Do I, as a Christian, have to live with my wife, with that woman any longer? Isn't it pathetic to think that after 30 years of life together, one of them could speak of the other in that fashion? I wrote him, you're a smart man. I can tell by the sparkle of your mind. You tell me that you are a Christian man. Why don't you feel some love for that mean old woman? Maybe if she felt love coming toward her, she won't be quite so mean. It's appalling that people should hate each other like that. The simple solution is to live above hate, to live above resentment, to live above fighting back. If you think someone has treated you mean, then be still and say nothing. Nobody can argue with you very long if you don't argue back. This is the best way, unless that there is a principle involved. And if there is a principle involved, then fight the hardest battle of your life. Tolstoy one time said, where love is, God is. Those are great words. The surest way to feel Christ in your heart is to cease being mad at others, get over resentment, get through with hating, love that other person. Difficult? Yes, to be sure it is. It's never easy to love, but keep at it. And one of these days there will be a warm glow within your heart. One of the greatest victories in the world is one when you overcome an antipathy or a dislike, and there isn't anyone here who doesn't know the truth of what I am saying. The doctrine's not new. You and I have heard it for years and for years. The question for each of us to ask himself or herself is, how soon am I going to get around to practicing it? And then there is one other thing that we need to do. You and I have heard it said repeatedly, we need to practice the very presence of Christ in our life. Believe that he is actually personally with you. I have a book on my shelves that I read frequently, but I ought to not go at it only by fits and starts. I ought to read it a little bit every day, really. It is called the Book of Christian Classics, and it contains the stories of the great saints who have lived across the years. One of these men was Brother Lawrence, a French monk of the 16th century. He was a simple man, a baker in the monastery kitchen, and yet he is considered to be one of the great Christian saints of the Middle Ages. His hallmark was to practice the presence of Christ. And the sweet fragrance of his life has lasted over these 5 centuries. He said that Christ was as present and as real to him while he was working in the kitchen as when he was upon his knees at the Blessed Sacrament. Think of it. Christ was as real to him when he was working in the kitchen as when he was upon his knees at the Blessed Sacrament. Well, you may say, well, that's all right for a mystic of the Middle Ages, but that kind of thing doesn't happen today, doesn't it? I once heard Dr. Norman Vincent Peale tell this story at Hennepin Avenue United Methodist Church in Minneapolis. I had gone home for a little vacation during the summertime following my first year at seminary. Dr. Peale told this story. When he was on the Pacific coast, he met a young fellow with whom he had previously corresponded. This boy was a tough and rough sort of fellow. And he had written Dr. Peale from Korea when he was in the service over there. In some way, he had at that time acquired and read some of Dr. Peale's sermons. There wasn't much of anything else around to read, he told Dr. Peale in writing. He had been brought up in the church, and he knew that God could be with you, that Christ could be by your side. He had heard it all of his life, but he hadn't taken very much stock in it. How could God, the great God, be with you? How could God, who was crucified on Calvary's cross in the name of the Christ, be with you when that all happened 2,000 years ago? He considered it a rather fanciful idea until one night he was on guard duty at the front. And frankly, he wrote, I was scared to death. I was cold. I was filled with fear. I was alone, and the next century was quite a distance away. And I began thinking about that idea of the presence of God, and I said, Lord, can it be true that you can really be with even one of my buddies, or perhaps even myself, really with a fellow like we are? And then I thought, I don't really believe it, but I'm going to try to believe it. And so I stood there and sort of prayed to God and talked to him. And then what do you know? All of a sudden, right there in that inky blackness, I felt him. It was just as though another presence was beside me. I could almost touch him. And from that moment, I felt no more fear in the midst of the comfort of his presence. As I said, Dr. Peale met this young man when he was on the West Coast. And he said to him, do you still feel him? Not all the time, the boy answered, but I know how to feel him. I just forget everything else and tell him that I need him. I tell him how sad I am, how bad I've been, and how good I want to be. I just asked him to come and be with me, and I feel him there in my heart. Dr. Peale closed the story by saying he's a big, fine-looking lad. He's lovable, he's rough. And as I looked into his face and saw the expression in his eyes, I knew that he had Jesus Christ in his heart. Well, there it is. Get the heart filled with the spirit of love. Empty it of all the ill will and practice his presence and believe that he is with you and act as though he is with you, and you will have the greatest of all experiences, even though over 20 centuries have passed since Jesus walked upon this earth. You can still feel him in your heart. And so here we are in Zion United Methodist Church in Lucky, Ohio. The wonderful thing about all this is that I really feel him in my heart this morning, right now. And I know that you can feel him in yours. This then becomes our ultimate task. Once you love him in your heart, then your next big job is to give him to the hearts of other people. Share him with other people. That's all that is needed to bring about a spiritual awakening for our world, for our home, for our church. This is the way we can change not only our own lives, but the lives of other people around us. Because you love, you care. And because you care, you love. That's how it is with God's love. Once you've experienced it, Kurt Kaiser wrote in a hymn, you want to spread his love to everyone. You want to pass it on. Amen.